Dr. Laura Bennett stared at the data scrolling across her screen in the quiet hours of the Mercury Research Station's night cycle. Her eyes burned from lack of sleep, but she couldn't stop reading. Something about these combat readings from the Proxima Centauri battles didn't make sense, and that might be the most exciting thing she'd seen in years. The space outside her window showed the eternal dark side of Mercury, dotted with the lights of other research modules. The station spun slowly, creating artificial gravity that made her coffee cup stay firmly on her desk. She took another sip of the cold liquid and frowned at the numbers. "Alan, can you come look at this?" She called out to her research partner, who was dozing in the corner of their shared lab. Dr. Alan Phillips jerked awake, his datapad sliding off his lap. He shuffled over, still trying to wake up properly. "What's got you excited at this hour?" "Look at these energy readings from the barrier contact points," Laura said, pointing to several peaks in the data. "Every time our ships fired their main weapons near the barriers during the skirmishes, there was a response. Not just any response, a pattern. The barriers had been humanity's biggest headache since they'd reached for the stars. Invisible walls of pure energy that blocked off vast sections of space, forcing ships to take long detours around them. Every species they'd met said the same thing. The barriers were eternal, unchangeable, put there by the Guardians countless ages ago." Alan leaned closer, his sleepiness forgotten. "That's impossible. The barriers don't react to anything. We've tried everything from antimatter to zero-point energy. We've tried everything in controlled experiments," Laura corrected him. "But look here. When the barrier was hit by scattered fire from the new quantum torpedoes, it actually rippled. The energy signature changed for a few microseconds." She pulled up another screen showing a 3D model of the barrier structure. "I think we've been looking at this all wrong. These aren't natural phenomena. They're artificial constructs, like a fence or a wall. And every fence has its weak points." Alan began typing rapidly on a nearby console, cross-referencing her findings with other battle data. "If you're right, this could change everything. But why would weapons fire affect them when our research tools don't?" Laura stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "Because we've been too careful, too precise. In battle, our weapons create chaos. Multiple frequencies, scattered effects, overlapping fields. We might have accidentally hit the right combination." Over the next few hours, they dug deeper into the data. The station's AI helped them sort through thousands of combat recordings, looking for similar patterns. Each time they found one, they added it to their growing model of the barrier's response patterns. As the station's day cycle began, bringing artificial dawn to their module, they had enough evidence to support a theory. Laura recorded their findings while Alan triple-checked their calculations. "Theory log," Dr. Laura Bennett recording. She spoke clearly for the station's records. "We believe the space barriers encountered throughout known space are artificial constructs created by the species known as the Guardians. Unlike previous assumptions of their immutable nature, our data suggests they respond to specific energy patterns, particularly those created by human quantum warfare technology." She paused, knowing how the next part would sound. "The barriers appear to have programming, for lack of a better word, that reacts to certain combinations of energy signatures. Our weapons, specifically in chaotic combat situations, have accidentally produced these combinations." Alan interrupted from his workstation. "Laura, you need to see this. I ran a simulation of focused quantum bombardment using the patterns we identified." The main screen lit up with a complex energy model. In the simulation, a small section of the barrier became transparent, creating a passage just large enough for a ship to pass through. "It's not about breaking the barriers," Laura whispered, understanding dawning in her tired mind. "It's about speaking their language. The Guardians built them to respond to specific signals. We just never knew what signals to send." The station's morning shift was arriving now, other scientists filtering into nearby labs. Laura and Alan barely noticed them, too absorbed in their work. They spent the next several hours refining their models and preparing their report for Earth Command. "Do you realize what this means?" Alan asked as they finally prepared to get some sleep. "If we can replicate this in controlled conditions, we could open up whole new sectors of space. Routes that would take months could be crossed in days." Laura nodded, but her expression was troubled. "It also means the Guardians were more advanced than anyone imagined. These barriers, they're not just walls. They're more like security checkpoints. The question is, what were they trying to keep in, or keep out?" Before they could send their findings to Earth, the station's alert system activated. A message from the diplomatic court flashed across their screens. An Arcturian delegation was requesting an immediate meeting with the station's research staff. How did they know? Ellen wondered aloud. "We just made this discovery ourselves." Laura remembered something from her xenorchaeology studies. The Arcturians were one of the first species to encounter the barriers. Their oldest records mention them. Maybe they detected our weapons tests during the Proxima battles and drew their own conclusions. Station Director Paul Rogers called an emergency meeting in the main conference room. As Laura and Alan hurried through the corridors, they could see the Arcturian ship through the station's observation windows. It hung in space like a giant silver leaf, reflecting Mercury's distant sunlight. "Whatever happens in this meeting," Laura told Alan as they reached the conference room, "we can't back down. This isn't just about faster travel routes anymore. We might have stumbled onto one of the biggest mysteries in the galaxy." The conference room doors slid open, revealing the waiting Arcturian delegation. Their tall, crystalline forms seemed to shimmer in the station's lights. Laura took a deep breath and stepped forward, clutching her datapad with their findings. She had a feeling that the next few hours would change the course of human history, and perhaps the history of every species in known space. As she began her presentation, Laura couldn't help but wonder, somewhere out there, were the Guardians watching? And if they were, what would they think about humanity starting to unravel their ancient secrets? The answers to those questions would come sooner than anyone expected, and they would shake the foundations of galactic society forever. The data continued to scroll across her screen, each line confirming their discovery. The barriers could be opened. The impossible was possible. And humanity, with its peculiar blend of warfare and scientific curiosity, had found the key that had eluded the galaxy's greatest minds for millennia. The real question now wasn't whether they could open the barriers. It was whether they should. But looking at the eager faces of her colleagues and the unreadable crystalline features of the Arcturians, Laura knew that question had already been answered. There was no going back now. The future of space travel was about to change forever. And it had all started with a sleepless night and some unexpected patterns in combat data. Commander Peter Morrison stood at the bridge of the Starweaver, watching the space barrier shimmer like heat waves on a summer day. His ship floated just outside the safe distance line, preparing for humanity's first attempt to break through what many called the unbreakable. "All systems check complete, Commander," Susan Carter called from her engineering station. The chief engineer had spent the last 3 weeks modifying their defensive systems according to Dr. Bennett's specifications. Dark circles under her eyes showed how little she had slept. Peter nodded, trying to hide his nervousness. "Status report from all sections." "Medical bay standing by," came the first response. "Engine room ready. Defensive systems modified and online. Emergency protocols active." One by one, each section reported in. Peter looked around at his crew, all of them the best Earth had to offer. They had trained for months for this moment, but nothing could truly prepare them for what they were about to attempt. "Begin recording," Peter ordered. "This is Commander Peter Morrison of the research vessel Starweaver. The time is 900 hours Earth Standard Time. We are beginning the first controlled test of the Bennett-Phillips barrier interface theory." Susan's fingers flew across her console, making final adjustments, charging the modified shield emitters. Power at 20%. 40. 60. The ship's lights dimmed slightly as power was diverted to the experimental systems. On the main screen, A diagram showed the energy building up in waves that matched the patterns discovered in the combat data. Multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light speed, the sensor operator announced suddenly. 3 Arcturian vessels, 2 Proximan, and 5 others of unknown design. Peter frowned. They had expected observers, but not this many. Continue with the test. Susan, how long until full power? 90%. We're almost there. The space around the Starweaver began to glow with a soft blue light. The barrier ahead of them seemed to ripple more strongly, responding to their energy patterns. Commander, the communications officer spoke up. We're receiving a transmission from the Arcturian flagship. Put it through. The stern face of Ambassador Zilix appeared on the screen. The crystalline being's features caught the light in strange ways as it spoke. Commander Morrison, we must ask you to cease this dangerous experiment immediately. The barriers have maintained galactic peace for countless generations. They are not meant to be breached. With respect, Ambassador, Peter replied, keeping his voice steady. We have full authority from Earth Command to proceed with this test. We're not destroying the barrier. We're learning to communicate with it. You do not understand the forces you are dealing with, Zilix warned. The Guardians placed these barriers for a reason. Power at full capacity, Susan interrupted, ready to begin the test sequence. Peter took a deep breath. Proceed with the test. The modified shields pulsed, sending waves of quantum energy toward the barrier. At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then, slowly, a small section of the barrier began to change color, shifting from its usual transparent shimmer to a deeper blue. Energy patterns matching our predictions, Susan reported excitedly. The barrier is responding exactly as Dr. Bennett's theory suggested. The watching alien ships moved closer, their sensors undoubtedly recording every detail. Peter could feel the tension on his bridge rising with each passing second. Phase 2 beginning now, Susan announced. She adjusted several controls, changing the frequency of their energy pulses, attempting to create a stable passage. The blue section of the barrier suddenly flared bright white. Warning alarms blared across the bridge. Power surge in the shield emitters, Susan shouted. The barrier is feeding energy back into our systems. Cut power, Peter ordered. Emergency shutdown. But it was too late. A blast of energy shot from the barrier, hitting the Starweaver's shields. The ship shuddered violently, sending crew members sprawling. Shields at critical levels. Susan worked frantically at her station. The energy feedback is overloading our systems. Divert power to emergency buffers. Peter grabbed his chair as another shudder ran through the ship. Get those emitters offline now. The next few minutes were chaos as the crew fought to regain control of their systems. When the emergency finally ended, the bridge was eerily quiet except for the sound of warning buzzers and damage reports coming in from all sections. Damage report, Peter called out, straightening his uniform. Minor injuries reported in sections 3 and 4. The medical officer responded. No casualties. Shield emitters are fried, Susan added grimly. We'll need at least 2 days to repair them. Commander, a quiet voice spoke up from the science station. Kevin Martinez, their junior engineer, had been studying his readings throughout the crisis. I think I found something interesting in the barrier's response. Peter walked over to Kevin's station. What did you see? The barrier didn't just reject our attempt to pass through, Kevin explained, pointing to his screen. It responded with its own pattern. Look at these energy signatures. They're like echoes of our signals, but changed somehow. Peter studied the readings. Get this data to Dr. Walsh in the AI lab. Maybe she can make sense of these patterns. The communications officer spoke up again. Commander, the Arcturian ambassador is requesting to board. He says there are things we need to know about the barriers. Peter looked out at the still shimmering barrier, then at the alien ships surrounding them. The test had failed, but something about Kevin's discovery nagged at him. They were missing something important. Tell the ambassador we'll welcome him aboard in 1 hour, Peter decided. First, I want everyone who observed that energy pattern in a meeting. Susan, Kevin, gather whatever data you've collected. We're not giving up yet. As the crew moved to carry out his orders, Peter remained at the window, watching the barrier. The Arcturians were right. The Guardians had put these barriers here for a reason. But now he was sure of something else. The barriers weren't just walls. They were trying to tell them something. In the ship's eye lab, Dr. Catherine Walsh was already setting up her systems to analyze the new data. The pattern of the barrier's response might hold the key to their next attempt. And next time, they would be ready for it. The failure of their first test had taught them something valuable. They couldn't force their way through the barriers with brute force. They needed to understand them first. As Peter watched the alien ships circling his wounded vessel, he wondered what other secrets the barriers held, and what price they might have to pay to learn them. Susan approached him with a preliminary damage report. "It'll take time to repair everything, sir, but we're already learning from what went wrong. Next time will be different." Peter nodded, his determination growing. "Next time, we'll listen to what the barrier is trying to tell us. The Guardians built these barriers to last for ages. They must have left instructions for how to use them properly." As the crew began their repairs and the Arcturian shuttle approached for docking, Peter couldn't shake the feeling that their failed test was just the beginning. They had taken the first step on a path that would change the galaxy forever. Now they just had to figure out where that path led. Kevin Martinez couldn't sleep. The young engineer sat in the Starweaver's observation lounge, staring at the space barrier through the large windows. 2 days had passed since their failed test, but the strange patterns he'd seen in the barrier's response wouldn't leave his mind. The door slid open, and Dr. Catherine Walsh walked in. The ship's AI specialist carried 2 cups of coffee, offering one to Kevin. "Still puzzling over the data?" she asked, sitting down beside him. Kevin nodded, taking the coffee gratefully. "Something about those energy patterns feels familiar, but I can't place it. It's like the barrier was trying to show us something." Catherine pulled up a holographic display of the test data. The failed attempt's energy patterns floated in the air between them, a dance of light and numbers. "Show me what you're seeing." "Look here," Kevin pointed to a particular sequence. "When we hit the barrier with our energy pulse, it didn't just reflect it. It changed it, reformed it, and sent it back in a new pattern. Almost like..." He trailed off, a memory surfacing from his childhood. "Like when I took martial arts classes, my teacher always said, 'Don't fight the opponent's force. Redirect it.'" Catherine sat up straighter, her eyes widening. "Computer, display the barrier's response pattern as a waveform." The hologram changed, showing flowing lines of energy that curved and twisted around each other. Catherine's fingers moved quickly, marking specific points in the pattern. "Kevin, you might be onto something," she said excitedly. "We've been treating this like a wall to break through, but what if it's more like a dance partner?" She rushed to a nearby console and began typing rapidly. "Look at this. When we hit the barrier with our energy pulse, it didn't just block us. It took our energy and tried to show us the correct pattern, the way we should have shaped our pulse in the first place." Kevin moved to watch over her shoulder, like a teacher showing a student the right way to move. "Exactly." Catherine's fingers flew across the keyboard. "The Guardians didn't just build walls. They built teachers. The barriers are supposed to show us how to pass through them safely." They spent the next few hours analyzing the data with their new perspective. When Commander Morrison arrived for his morning shift, he found them surrounded by holographic displays and empty coffee cups. "Commander," Kevin jumped up, "we think we know what went wrong with the test." Peter listened carefully as they explained their theory. The more he heard, the more his excitement grew. "So instead of trying to force our way through, we need to harmonize with the barrier," Catherine finished. "Match its energy patterns, move with them instead of against them, like a martial arts student learning from a master." Peter called an emergency meeting of the senior staff. In the conference room, Susan Carter studied the new calculations with growing interest. "We can modify the shield emitters to work this way," she said, "but we'll need to completely change our approach. Instead of one big pulse, we'll need to send out waves of energy that can adapt and change based on the barrier's responses." The Arcturian ambassador, who had remained on board after the failed test, listened to their plan with growing concern. "What you propose has never been attempted. The barriers have always been immutable, unchangeable." "Maybe," Peter replied. "That's because no one ever tried to learn from them instead of fight them." They spent the next 12 hours preparing for the second test. Susan and her engineering team reconfigured the shield emitters, while Catherine and Kevin refined their understanding of the barrier's patterns. As they made their final preparations, Peter noticed Kevin practicing martial arts moves in a quiet corner of the engine room. "It helps me visualize the energy patterns," Kevin explained, looking embarrassed. "Each move flows into the next, just like the barrier's responses should flow into ours." Finally, they were ready. The Starweaver moved back into position, while the alien ships watched from a safe distance. "Shield modifications complete," Susan reported. "Power systems reconfigured for adaptive response. AI systems ready to analyze and match barrier patterns," Catherine added. Peter took his command chair. "Begin test sequence. Remember, we're not fighting the barrier this time. We're learning from it." The first energy pulse was gentle, almost tentative. The barrier shimmed in response, sending back its own pattern. This time, instead of trying to force their way through, they watched and learned. "Analyzing response pattern," Catherine called out. "Adjusting our output to match." The ship's energy emissions changed, shifting to mirror the barrier's rhythm. A soft blue glow began to build where the two patterns met. "Power holding steady," Susan reported. No sign of the feedback loop that caused the first failure. Minutes passed as they carefully built up the resonance between their energy and the barriers. The blue glow grew stronger, more focused. "Look," Kevin pointed at the main screen. Where their energy met the barrier, a small area had begun to change. Not breaking or tearing, but opening, like a flower blooming in the morning sun. "Passage forming," Catherine confirmed. "The barrier is actually helping us create it." The opening grew slowly, carefully, until it was large enough for a ship to pass through. Unlike their first violent attempt, this felt natural, as if the barrier had been waiting all along for someone to learn its language. "Probe launched," Susan announced. They watched as the small device flew through the opening. "Readings coming in. Probe is undamaged. The passage is stable." A cheer went up from the crew. Peter smiled, but kept his focus on the readings. "Hold position. Let's make sure this stays stable before we celebrate." The next hour was tense as they ran every test they could think of on the passage. The opening remained stable, the barrier's energy working with theirs to maintain it. The silence on the bridge was broken by an incoming transmission. It was the Arcturian ambassador, but this time his crystalline features showed not warning but wonder. "In all our histories," he said quietly, "no one has ever seen the barriers respond this way. Perhaps we have all had much to learn." Peter looked at his crew, at Kevin's proud grin, Catherine's satisfied nod, Susan's tired but happy smile. Together, they had done what many thought impossible, not by fighting or forcing their way through, but by stopping to listen and learn. "Send the data to Earth Command," he ordered, "and to the Arcturians, and anyone else who wants to study it. This isn't just our breakthrough, it belongs to everyone." As the reports were transmitted, Peter watched the stable passage glowing before them. They had opened a door that had been closed for millennia. But somehow he knew this was just the beginning. The barriers had more to teach them, if they were willing to learn. Kevin stood at his station, still moving slightly in the gentle patterns he practiced. "You know what this means, right? Every barrier in space could be an opportunity to learn, not just an obstacle to overcome." Peter nodded. The young engineer had seen what they all missed. Sometimes the greatest discoveries come not from forcing your way forward, but from stopping to understand what's already there. The passage continued to glow, a testament to their success. But in the back of Peter's mind, a question lingered. Now that they had learned to open the barriers, what other secrets of the Guardians waited to be discovered? The success of the Starweaver's test brought more trouble than anyone expected. Captain Linda Harrison watched from the bridge of her ship, the Guardian, as 3 more Proximan warships appeared at the edge of her scanner range. This was the 4th group today. "They're testing our defenses," her tactical officer said quietly. "Looking for weak spots." Linda nodded. Her fleet of 5 ships formed a protective ring around the Mercury Research Station, where Dr. Bennett and her team worked to understand their breakthrough. The Proximan Unity wanted the barrier-breaking technology, and they weren't the only ones. "Message from Dr. Richard Cooper on the station," her communications officer announced. "He says it's urgent." Richard's worried face appeared on her screen. "Captain, we're picking up strange signals. They're coming from the direction of the nearest barrier, but they're like nothing we've seen before." "The Guardians?" Linda asked, feeling the chill run down her spine. "We think so. The signal started right after we successfully opened that passage. They're getting stronger every hour." Before Linda could respond, alarms blared across her bridge. Multiple ships dropping out of faster-than-light speed, her tactical officer shouted. "Proximan signatures. At least 12 vessels." "Alert the fleet," Linda ordered. "Defensive formation Delta. And get me a secure line to Earth Command." The next few hours were chaos. The Proximan ships pushed forward, not firing yet, but making their intentions clear. They wanted access to the station, and they weren't taking no for an answer. On the station, Richard worked frantically to decode the Guardian signals. Each passing minute brought new patterns, new complexities. "It's like they're waking up," he told his team. "After all these centuries, our breakthrough stirred something." The main lab screens filled with scrolling data as the Guardian signals grew stronger. Patterns within patterns, messages hidden in waves of energy that made the computers strain to keep up. "Look at this," one of his assistants called out. "The signals, they're not just random. They're repeating, like a countdown." Richard's blood ran cold. "Get me Captain Harrison. Now." On the Guardian's bridge, Linda was dealing with her own crisis. The Proximan fleet had split into 3 groups, each one probing her defenses from a different angle. They were good, too good to fight without taking heavy losses. "Captain," her communications officer interrupted. "The Proximan commander is requesting to speak with you." The alien's face appeared on her screen, shadows of tentacles moving behind its breathing mask. "Captain Harrison," it said in carefully practiced English, "we mean no hostility. We simply wish to share in humanity's discovery." "The technology will be shared with all species," Linda replied firmly. "Once we fully understand it. These are delicate negotiations that can't be rushed." "Perhaps you don't understand." The Proximan commander's voice hardened. "We've waited millennia to pass the barriers. We will not wait any longer." The transmission cut off. Moments later, the Proximan ships began to move. "They're making their move," Linda's tactical officer warned. "Multiple weapon systems powering up." "Alert all ships," Linda ordered. "Defensive positions. Do not fire unless fired upon. And get me." Her words were cut off by a brilliant flash of light from the direction of the nearest barrier. The entire fleet's sensors went wild as waves of energy pulsed through space. "Captain," Richard's voice came through urgently. "The Guardian signals, they're not a countdown. They're a warning." The barrier nearest to them began to shimmer and pulse with colors no one had ever seen before. The Proximan ships pulled back, their attack forgotten in the face of this new development. "All ships, maintain position," Linda ordered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Dr. Cooper, what kind of warning?" "We're still translating, but we think." Richard's voice cut off as another pulse of energy swept through the area. When it cleared, new signals were appearing on every screen. Across the station and fleet, computers began displaying the same message, translated from the Guardian signals. ATTNTYON. Barrier Network CQRATQRO2COLs. Activated. Unauthorized ACCSS DTECTD. Beginning system scan. Linda watched in awe as lines of energy began spreading from the barrier, forming a web of light that stretched as far as their sensors could see. The Proximan ships retreated further, their weapons forgotten. "They're scanning everything," Richard reported, his voice filled with wonder. "Every ship, every station, every piece of technology in range. The Guardians, they're not just awake. They're checking their territory." The next few hours were tense as the scan continued. Ships from other species arrived, drawn by the unprecedented event. The barriers, silent for so long, were active again. Linda maintained her defensive position around the station, but her attention was split between the Proximan fleet and the increasingly complex patterns emerging from the barriers. The Guardians were doing more than scanning. They were sending data, massive amounts of it. "Captain," Richard called again, "we're beginning to decode some of the data. It's incredible. The barriers. They're not just walls. They're parts of a huge network, a system designed to teach." "Teach what?" Linda asked. "Everything. How to safely travel through space, how to handle dangerous technologies, how to be ready for something the Guardians knew was coming." As if in response to his words, new signals began broadcasting from the barriers. The message was simple but clear. "Evaluation beginning. Prepare for ASSESS. Linda looked out at the fleet of alien ships now gathering around them. The Proximans, the Arcturians, and a dozen other species, all watching as ancient machines stirred to life. Their discovery hadn't just opened a passage through space. It had awakened the greatest teachers in galactic history. And now, ready or not, the lesson was about to begin. Fleet Admiral Daniel Wright stood in Earth Command's main conference room, looking at representatives from 20 different alien species. A month had passed since the Guardians awakened, and everything had changed. "The choice before us is simple," he said, his voice carrying across the quiet room. "We can fight each other for control of the barrier technology, or we can work together to understand what the Guardians are trying to teach us." On the large screen behind him, the latest data from Dr. Bennett's team showed the complex patterns of Guardian signals. The barriers were more active than ever, pulsing with energy and information. "Our latest tests show something remarkable," Daniel continued. "When ships from different species work together, combining their energy patterns, the barriers respond more strongly. They're not just teaching us about space travel, they're teaching us about cooperation." The Proximan leader, who had once threatened to attack the research station, raised a tentacle. "You suggest we share the technology, after all our species have fought for so long?" "I suggest we have no choice," Daniel replied. "Dr. Cooper, please show them." Richard stood up from his seat and pressed a button on his datapad. New images appeared on the screen. Massive energy readings from deep space, beyond the barrier network. "The Guardians built these barriers for a reason," Richard explained. "They knew something was coming, something that would require all our species to work together if we want to survive." The room erupted in worried whispers. The Arcturian ambassador's crystalline form sparkled as he spoke. "What is coming?" "We don't know yet," Richard admitted. "But the Guardian data suggests it's something that no single species could face alone. They left us these barriers as training grounds, waiting for the day we would learn to work together instead of fighting each other." Susan Carter, now head of the Combined Species Engineering Team, stepped forward. "We've developed a new system for crossing the barriers, but it requires ships from at least 3 different species working in perfect harmony." She pressed a button, and a hologram appeared in the center of the room. It showed 3 ships, 1 human, 1 Proximan, and 1 Arcturian, moving in sync, their energy patterns weaving together to create a stable passage through a barrier. The barriers respond to cooperation, Susan explained. The more species work together, the stronger and more stable the passages become. It's not just about the technology, it's about trust. The room was quiet as everyone considered this. Centuries of distrust and competition between species wouldn't disappear overnight. But the threat of something worse coming made old rivalries seem less important. Kevin Martinez, who had first understood the need to work with the barriers instead of against them, spoke up from his place near the door. We've learned that the barriers aren't walls. They're bridges, but we have to build them together. Over the next few hours, the representatives discussed and debated. Some argued for keeping the old ways, staying behind their safe walls. Others pushed for immediate action, wanting to prepare for whatever threat the Guardians had foreseen. Finally, Daniel called for a vote. One by one, each species made their choice. When the last vote was cast, the decision was clear. They would move forward together. The first combined fleet will launch next week, Daniel announced. Ships from every willing species working together to map the barrier network and understand its messages. Dr. Bennett will lead the research team. Laura Bennett stood up, looking both excited and nervous. The Guardians left us more than just warnings. They left us their knowledge, their technology, their understanding of the universe. But they made sure we could only access it by working together. As the meeting ended and the representatives filed out, Daniel walked to the window. Earth shone below them, beautiful and fragile in the darkness of space. The barrier network stretched across the galaxy, no longer a prison but a promise of something greater. Richard joined him at the window. The Guardian signals are getting stronger, he said quietly. Whatever's coming, we don't have much time. Then we'll face it together, Daniel replied. Every species bringing its own strengths, its own knowledge. The barriers taught us how to work together. Now we'll show the galaxy what we can do when we stop fighting and start cooperating. In the weeks that followed, the combined fleet began its mission. Ships that once would have fought each other now flew in formation, their crews learning to trust and rely on one another. Each successful passage through a barrier made them stronger, more unified. The Guardians continued to send their signals, guiding them towards something. Whether it was a threat or an opportunity, no one knew. But they would face it as one galaxy, not as separate species. Laura stood on the bridge of the lead ship, watching as human, Proximan, and Arcturian crews worked side by side. The barriers glowed ahead of them, no longer walls but doorways to a future none of them could have imagined. Ready to make the jump? She asked the combined crew. The human pilot nodded. The Proximan engineer raised a tentacle in agreement. The Arcturian navigator's crystalline form sparkled with anticipation. Together, they reached out to the barrier, their ships moving in perfect harmony. The passage opened before them, larger and more stable than any they had created before. Through it, they could see new stars, new worlds, new possibilities. As they passed through, Laura smiled. The war science that had first cracked the barrier's secret had led them to something greater than victory. It had led them to unity. Whatever waited for them beyond the barriers, they would face it not as enemies or competitors, but as one galaxy, united at last.